Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Paul Adepoju. I'm the community manager for the ICFJ Pamela Howard Global Crisis Reporting Forum, which has been our effort geared towards improving and expanding crisis reporting capabilities of journalists from across the world. Crisis comes in different forms and formats. And while some are issues you can actually physically see, and I've already gotten these ideal crisis label issues like the global pandemic, the crisis in Ukraine, the food crisis, economic crisis, insecurity and poverty and other issues. These are easily described as crises, but we also have crises emanating from the digital world. And sometimes these happen, and very few individuals actually categorize these developments as crises. But we've seen the effects that they can have, including potentially having effect on national elections that could have global implications. I remember when I first saw the first deep fake, and it was something that I felt, no, this is too easy to figure out that this is a fake video. But since the time that deep fake emerged till now, they've advanced, they've become much more easier to pull off, and they are now increasingly grabbing attention because of the threat that they potentially pose to journalism, and how journalists may still have to struggle to make sense of these tools and convince the general public about what is true and what is not true. Even though even the journalists' goals are to really report the news, we can no longer ignore deepfakes and synthetic media, and that is why today's webinar is focused on introducing deepfakes and synthetic media to journalists. And at the end of it, we hope we'll be able to have expanded your body of knowledge regarding how to properly tackle the issue of deepfakes. And subsequently, next week, we'll also look at how we can ethically deploy deepfakes and synthetic media in journalism. And we have a professional here that will be leading this conversation. And his name is Sam Gregory, who is an award-winning technologist, media maker, and advocate. Sam is a program director for Witness. Witness helps people to use video and technology to defend human rights. Founded after the Rodney King incident, Witness has 30 years of experience in over 100 countries where they are supporting critical use of video to secure accountability and reach millions of people with skills and tools. And these tools include engaging technology giants in order to on how their technology makes a difference and maximize civic participation via visual and social media. Good day, Sam. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Paul. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I'm looking forward to talking to folks about this week about the malicious side of deepfakes, and next week about the more pro-social usages that are found in journalism and elsewhere.
Yes, that's really cool. It's an extensive conversation that I'm personally interested in, because I've really been curious about how this works and how they could potentially impact journalism as a whole. So what I will like, before we start the presentation, I would like to give some house rules. So if you are joining us on the Zoom platform and you have any question to ask, use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform for your questions, and we'll get to the questions at the right time. And if you're watching this live stream on Facebook and you would like to engage with us, use the chat box under the video that you are watching right now, and we are going to address the question at the right time. And I would also like to know where you, our audience, you are from. So if you can use the chat box now to engage us on where you are joining us from, we really like that. That can also guide us in being able to laser focus some aspects of this dialogue to issues affecting your geographical area. Yeah, that's it. Sam, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah, thank you. You can share your screen. I'll join you for the interactive session.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone to talk about tackling deepfakes and synthetic media in journalism. As Paul explained, I'm the program director of Witness, and I lead an initiative called Prepare, Don't Panic that is focused on supporting an inclusive global approach to the malicious uses of deepfakes and other forms of audiovisual manipulation, and on supporting innovations in media trust, provenance, and authenticity. And just to contextualize for folks where I come from as a member of the Witness team, we work globally, and a lot of our work is really supporting people to create trustworthy information. And I think when we look at deepfakes and we start to think about the solutions, part of the solution is, of course, how we reinforce an ecosystem of trustworthy information. Now that, in Witness's case, is often human rights defenders and citizen journalists on the front lines of conflict and of state violence. For example, right now in Ukraine, where we are sharing guidance on how to document in a more trustworthy, evidentiary way, and have done so in the past in many other contexts globally. We have to start from this trustworthy information perspective. At the same time, in the Witness context, we've seen that there is a constant battle between trustworthy information and deceptive information. So a significant part of our work as a human rights organization that works with civic journalists and citizen journalists is also to find ways to challenge misinformation and support the creation of more verifiable information. So, flashing up on the screen at the moment, some of the work we do around visual verification. And we do this also thinking from a tools layer. So we've collaborated over the years with groups like the Guardian Project to build tools like proof mode. It's an easy way to add rich metadata to a photo or video and cryptographically hash it so that you can show where it came from that hasn't been tampered with. And of course, the context of all of this, and human rights defenders and journalists face the same problem, is that often authorities and people in power challenge the veracity, the truth of the content we produce, particularly when it challenges that power. And just flashing up here, an example from the Witness team in Africa, involved in the End SARS movement there against police violence, and the response of the Nigerian military, who dismissed the incriminating footage as fake or falsified. So it's within this context that I want to talk about how we tackle malicious deepfakes, this new form of audiovisual manipulation. And Witness has done this over the past 4 years in this Prepare, Don't Panic initiative. We were, in fact, the first organization I know of to bring together journalists and technologists and human rights defenders across the globe to really talk about the needs, the threats, and the desired solutions. And if you go to our webpage, you can find many different resources that look at regional needs at different aspects. So I encourage you really to dig in and learn more at the website you see at the bottom of the page here. And the work very much comes from what we describe as this prepare, don't panic approach. What I mean by that is we're thinking very much around how the rhetoric around deepfakes, which is this idea that deepfakes are going to destabilize all possible truth in or possible belief in images and video, is already creating its own harms. And I'm going to come back to that later, as one of the real challenges that journalists and others face is the destabilizing rhetoric around deepfakes and the way it lends itself to people in power to claim that true video is false is already a problem and is likely to get worse. So we really need to focus on not panicking, but preparing. And then the second place we start from is, in fact, in the area of deepfakes, there are a lot of people who want to solve this problem. They want to solve for deepfakes, but are they listening to the right range of people globally with lived and expert experience? And one of the key constituencies in our work, and we've done this work with the BBC and Western journalists, we've done it in Brazil, in South Africa, in Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, is centering journalists as one of the key groups who need to really identify what they need in this emerging landscape. So I'm going to cover 3 areas in the discussion today. I want to do first a brief introduction to deepfakes so people understand what we're talking about in terms of technologies. Then I'm going to talk about the threats that are emerging and how they relate to journalism. And then I'm going to talk about the solutions. And then next week, I'll be back and we'll be talking around kind of the pro-social usages of deepfakes and synthetic media for journalism and related spaces. So first of all, what are deepfakes? Let me show a couple of examples on this slide of media items produced with what are known as deepfakes, and synthetic media, which is sort of broader category that we might think of. And this shows really the range of what you can do with these types of technologies. So on the left, you just saw an animated photo. This is my great-grandmother. She is colorized, she is animated. This was just done on a website called Deep Nostalgia. Very simple, I just dropped in a photo. This is the most easy way of using these tools, using a photo, making it move. The second one on this page.
Ви росіяни. Зараз ваші військові розпочали війну. Війну в нашій державі. Я залишаюсь в урядовому кварталі.
This is a deepfake made in a commercial app. In fact, a commercial app located in Ukraine, Reface, which made it possible for anyone to put their face in Zelensky's body. In this case, I put Tom Cruise's face. So this is the middle part of the deepfake spectrum, the ability to use commercial apps to do things like face swap. And then the final video I want to show is this one.
What's up, TikTok? You guys cool if I play some sports?
And this is the high end of deepfakes production. This is a face swap of Tom Cruise, the actor's face, onto a very talented impersonator, and then with sort of visual effects applied afterwards. So on the left-hand side, the simplest form of synthetic media, highly easy, highly accessible, relies on one image into a model that's already been trained. On the right-hand side, this took real work. They had to really train and customize a deepfake tool to create this very convincing replica of the actor Tom Cruise. And all of these tools work essentially with some similarities. They're built on the latest AI and machine learning approaches that take training data. In the case of these ones, training data would be images of faces or of faces or videos of a particular person, and they place them into algorithms that in many cases compete to create better and better fakes based on those data, right? So people often analogize this to a cat and mouse game, which means that what they mean by that is you have one AI system that, for example, is trying to create a forgery of Tom Cruise's face, and then another AI system that's trying to detect it. Every time it detects the forgery, the forger improves, and then back and forth in this cat and mouse game of making a better and better version of, for example, the face of Tom Cruise. And I'm not going to go into the technical details of this. Suffice to say, there are many different ways you can structure those algorithms, improve them in order to achieve what you want. So what can we do with these technologies? I'm going to highlight a few things that are happening in this technical space. Some of them have not been used extensively in malicious ways. Others are starting to be used maliciously and in ways that implicate journalism and the practice of journalism. So one area which is very commonplace is the idea of object edits. What this means is when you use a tool like Adobe Photoshop or a Google Pixel magic camera function, you can erase something in a video, right? Like as I show here, erasing the car in the bicyclist video. You can do things like change the background or the context of a scene, right? In this case, this is not a recent video, it's actually from 4 or 5 years ago, adding snow to the image on the right. So making a non-snowy landscape look snowy. And again, this is fairly established technology. You can transfer the expressions on someone's face from one person, say a real person, to a representation of a real person. So in this video snapshot, you're seeing an actor making, in that case, Donald Trump's face move in alignment with him going like this. And you can do things that are about transferring motions. So I just showed an example or described something where we're talking about taking someone's face expressions and transferring them to a sort of digital puppet. Well, you can do that with motion as well. So in this case, this is work that shows how you transfer the motions of a professional dancer to a digital puppet, making them dance like that professional dancer. These have generally not been used maliciously to date, these techniques, but they exist and they're often quite highly commercialized, for example, those sort of photo edits. Let me move to the first area that we start to see being used maliciously, including in the realm of news and journalism, is the area of generating fake faces. This is a fairly baseline set of technologies that continue to be improved. This graphic is in fact from 2018 and shows you the improvement over the course of, in that case, 5 years in the technologies to make a face of someone who never existed. So these are representations of a face of a human who never existed. And it's likely that folks on this call will have encountered these faces potentially in your journalism practice. We're starting to see them being used in misinformation campaigns. So instead of stealing, say, my photo from Twitter and putting it on a suspect Twitter account, you use a fake photo generator to make a realistic photo. And then you use it in a misinformation account, or as we saw in Ukraine in February, you use it as a sort of an imposter journalist behind an account. And this is an area, and I'll come back to it, where we see a significant number of relatively low-level threats occurring for journalism and a relatively significant number of solutions emerging. And this technology isn't actually really about faces. It's simply about the ability to get a computer to create a realistic representation of an object. So, you know, there are sites online, you may be familiar with this person does not exist. You can also go to this cat does not exist, this rental does not exist, etc., and create a realistic representation. And these technologies are improving quite fast. Another area that we've seen used pretty extensively and a lot of commercial development happening is what's known as lip sync dubbing. So I'm about to show a video clip in which you see Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook CEO, saying something he never did, but with his lips aligned with what he says. So this is about aligning the lips of someone speaking with a soundtrack.
I wish I could keep telling you that our mission in life is connecting people, but it isn't. We just want to predict your future behaviors. Spectre showed me how to manipulate you into sharing intimate data about yourself and all those you love for free. The more you express yourself, the more we own you.
Now, we're starting to move into the territory where you can see how this is both used and potentially used for deception. Now, in the case of these videos, they might be combined with a voice clone or a voice skin. So it's another area of technology that's been advancing. And really the way to think about this is a voice clone is where I train a machine to speak my voice, and maybe can then just enter text and it speaks in my voice. And a voice skin is when, as I speak, my voice can be changed into another voice, right? And there's a huge amount of commercial development happening in this space, trying to think about things like dubbing and how do we improve the ability to translate between languages for commercial reasons. So important area of development. Again, you can start to think about how this might be used maliciously or in ways that are deceptive. And then finally, I want to come back to the face swap. And I started at the beginning with this Tom Cruise face swap. And I think the important thing to emphasize as we look at how journalists need to think about this is the face swap deepfakes remain the hardest to do very quickly, the hardest to do in complex situations. So although we think a lot about deepfakes as face swaps and very hyper realistic face swaps, it still is the hardest part of this spectrum to do and requires the most resources at the moment. So as you're thinking about it, you should be thinking about these set of emerging possibilities with deepfakes. You can alter video just like with photos, like the removing an object. You can create a realistic voice or face of a human who never existed, and you can manipulate the video or audio of someone's lips, their voice, their face, their body to make it appear someone said or did something they never did. So I want to move to the next section, which is about how we think about the threats here. And I think it's useful, and I don't have interaction with you. If we were in a room together, I'd be watching your faces, trying to think, is this audience skeptical about this? Are they really worried about this? What are they thinking? So I want you to do a mental exercise right now, is have a think about the hype around deepfakes. And on a scale of 1 to 10, ask yourself how concerned you are about AI manipulated media like deepfakes. 1, not concerned at all, 5, kind of in the middle, 10, you didn't sleep at night last night worrying about what you'd hear today. And then you can either just keep that in your head as your frame for the rest of the talk, or you can drop it in the chat. It's always interesting to see people's range of positioning on this, really, depending on their own personal experience, their professional experience, and their concerns about technology and social media. So ask yourself why you placed yourself at this place on the spectrum and use that as your mental framework for the rest of the talk. Now, I work on a whole range of misinformation, disinformation, fabricated media. And so I know very well that for many people, their main problem right now is not deepfakes. It's other forms of fake news, other forms of media manipulation, other forms of other questions in journalism, everything from ownership to press freedom to political suppression. And you might say something like, I have 1,000 problems, but deepfakes aren't one of them. So as a journalist, I want to explain why you might be concerned about these and what are the threats that are emerging. So should you be concerned? Maybe the first question. And again, remember, I come from a prepare, don't panic approach. The first thing is deepfakes have had way too much hype early on that overly centered these kind of apocalyptic scenarios of elections being thrown and compromised to what we might call as this infopocalypse idea, right? So this is an example headline from the US 2020 elections. Experts say deepfakes could swing the 2020 elections. I don't know who those experts were. I certainly didn't say that. I don't know people who said that. And this is the type of apocalyptic description of deepfakes that actually discredits the way that the technology is improving. And what I want to tell you is that the technology is getting better, right? There are reasons to take this seriously as journalists, as people concerned about mis and disinformation. And the reasons are partly technical, right? So some forms are getting progressively easier to do better with less data and without training them on a specific person. What I mean by that is you don't have to train your AI model on lots and lots of images of me to make, for example, certain manipulations of me. And audio and images are improving rapidly, as well as text and multimodal, i.e. the combination of different forms of media. And increasingly, these are available on mobile, right? Like that Reface app that I mentioned, you can do face swaps with hundreds of different people on that app. It's very fun and very available. And unfortunately, also some of the more malicious uses of deepfakes, and I'm going to talk in a moment about non-consensual sexual images, are very available on the web for relatively small amounts of money. You can pay someone to make a sexual image of someone without their consent. Certain threats are starting to become more common. I'm going to talk about the threats in a moment. Detection is inadequate. I'm going to talk about that. And of course, there are some fundamental physiological reasons we should be worried about photorealism we encounter, photorealistic fakery we encounter in places we didn't expect, like in our social media feed rather than in a Hollywood film. So how do we prioritize threats? So I'm going to talk about the threats that are existing and then some emerging threats. And the basis of the threat analysis that we've done is both a series of consultations globally that have taken place with journalists and human rights defenders and technologists around the world. And again, I want to reference you to this website if you want to look at, for example, the reports from different regions, get a sense of regional perspectives on this. You'll see a range of those perspectives. And we've also spent the last 4 years really listening very closely to the scenarios that are starting to happen. So what are the threats that you should be worried about? So I'm going to start with good news, and then I'm going to give you bad news, bad news, bad news. And I'm not sure that the good news is good news, frankly. So the good news is that there aren't that many deepfakes, relatively speaking. There are a lot of what we call shallow fakes, so miscontextualized, repurposed media, conventional edits, which I imagine everyone on this webinar will have encountered. The video that claims to be from one place is from another, a video that's selectively edited to remove important context. And, we just need to look at the Ukraine conflict right now to see that, right? Here's 3 videos, a couple. One is a CGI video that was passed off as a real video, a computer generation. The middle one is a recycled live stream pretending to be in a Ukrainian city, but from another location. And the third was a selectively edited video of the Chechen tyrant Kadyrov appearing to make him say something he didn't. So even as we pay attention to deepfakes, I want to emphasize that in the everyday world of journalism and human rights, the majority of things we encounter are shallow fakes, but we have to start preparing given what's happening technologically. So what are we seeing as existing and emerging deepfake threats? First, non-consensual sexual images remain the biggest deepfake problem. There are some statistics from a couple of years ago that indicated that the vast majority of online deepfakes were pornographic. That's a little hard to know if that figure still holds because of the growth of apps like Reface and the commercial growth, but it is undoubtedly true that the primary malicious use of deepfakes right now is to attack almost exclusively women with non-consensual sexual images. And this is a threat to journalists because, of course, journalists and women journalists are frequently targeted as public figures. Here's the survey from UNESCO on online video violence against women journalists from 2021 that showed about 15% had experienced image-based abuse, of which a significant proportion of that were deepfakes. And unfortunately, that's getting easier. You can access apps online that do this with photos and video. And it's very problematic. And unfortunately, there are not a great range of solutions in this area, partly because many of the questions that we might address with like misinformation deepfakes, such as we can prove it's false, are often not very effective on sexual or non-consensual sexual content because it's really not about proving false. And it's very hard to do that in the short period in which those videos start to circulate, as you know, the motivations to humiliate, harass, drive women from the public sphere don't necessarily relate to the solutions available. The second threat that we see is what I'd mentioned earlier, these deepfake faces known as GAN-generated faces used in targeted and broad deception campaigns. Here's a couple of examples. One, a face that was used as part of the election-related disinfo, misinfo around Hunter Biden and a supposed laptop. Right? Turned out the laptop exists, but there were stories that use this fake face of a supposed Australian journalist. Similarly from Ukraine here. We're starting to see this much more common in journalistic contexts, in commercial contexts, these fake faces that claim to be a real person but are of a person who does not exist. The third big threat area is in fact the one I worry about a lot, which is what's known as the liar's dividend. The liar's dividend is when you claim true is false and force people to prove an image is not manipulated. And that is getting easier. It's incredibly easy to say, when a video comes out, we don't know if that's true or false, maybe it could be, or it's a deep fake, and then put the pressure on journalists to prove it's true. We've seen incidents where the discussion around whether true or false has contributed to unrest. This is a well-known case in Gabon around a supposed deepfake of the president. And then on the right, a case from the country of Georgia, where a video that was shared by former President Saakashvili showing him in Georgia on the day of the elections when he was not supposed to be there, he was facing charges, was immediately dismissed by the Georgian government as a deepfake. So we see this reflexive, it's a deepfake claim being thrown out increasingly to undermine real footage. And then the final area where we're seeing threats starting to emerge is the increasing visibility of audio-based fraud cases. What this typically means actually in a business setting, someone trying to create an impersonating voice to, for example, get someone to do a bank transfer, make financial transactions. So these are the threats we see right now. We've also been doing work looking at the threats that are likely to emerge based on conversations with a broad range of journalists and fact checkers and others. And you know, I want to highlight a few of those that I think are really important to think about, and I'm going to point to them as we talk about how we tackle and what are the solutions. The first thing we've heard consistently is that the people who will be most at threat from this are probably not the senior politicians, the national level politicians, but in fact journalists and activists who are already targeted by state surveillance, by misinformation, by attacks on their credibility, and that we really need to look at how this contributes to existing challenges for journalists who are under-resourced, not necessarily well supported with skills and tools, under attack by their own states and by civil society or uncivil society. So really, that as we look ahead, we have to start preparing how does the journalism sector prepare for this additional burden of both deepfakes, but also the claims of deepfakery. And how do they do that in the ecosystem that exists where we know that, you know, we have this rapid digital wildfire of videos being shared rapidly on something like WhatsApp, where we're often in online video conferencing spaces like this one that are actually probably pretty vulnerable to deepfakes, and where of course we exist in a climate of declining public trust that makes it easier to make deepfake claims and to have people believe them. So let me now talk about the solutions and how journalists fit into solutions and what's available so far for journalists. So I'm going to talk about 4 solution areas that are particularly relevant to journalists. I'm highlighting a few others on the screen that I won't get to. I'm going to talk about the question of teaching journalists and others to spot these with the naked eye. Are there tools for detection and who has access? How do we build on existing journalistic skills and coordination? And are there tools for authentication? And again, who's excluded from these? So I'm going to start with the simple one. Can we teach you to spot deepfakes? And we're actually going to do this a little bit interactively. I'm going to show some GAN-generated photos and see how well you, as a group of people watching this, do in identifying them. So this is going to be a fairly simple exercise. You can drop your answers in the chat if you want to, or you can just think them. And I'm going to ask you in each case, is the left or the right image the true one? Which image is the real image, which is the deepfake? So let's have a go. Which of these is the deepfake? Which is the true image? Is it the left one or the right one? So if you want to, you can drop it in the chat. Otherwise, you can just have a think. So I'm going to say here, the true image is the left one. The one on the right is a GAN-generated photo. We might spot it because the earring here is kind of hanging in space. Maybe a clue. What about this one? Which of these is the real image? Is it the left one or the right one? Okay, if you guessed the left one, you are correct. The one on the right is a GAN-generated photo or a deepfake. And one way we might think about that is perhaps, you know, the background is kind of weird. Is that a forest? Is it an abstract painting? The hair is a little strange at the edges here. The forehead line is a little odd, right? So maybe some clues we can see. What about this one? Is the left one real or the right one real? This one maybe is the easiest of the ones I'm going to show you. The left one is real because the person here is drinking Guinness, and probably unless you'd been training this GAN generator to generate images of people drinking Guinness, you're unlikely to have this particular picture. The one on the right is a fake. And again, maybe the clothing doesn't seem right? The face is strong, but the clothing is odd if we look at the clothing here on the right-hand side. What about this one? Left hand real or right hand real? So in this case, the left hand one is real. The right hand one is a photo of someone who never existed. We might look at the eyes and think the reflection is odd, right? That doesn't seem like the way in which physics work, the way in which their eyes are reflecting. In this case, there's a little bit of distortion on the head. What about this one? Left hand real or right hand real? In this case, you see, I got you on this one. The left hand one is the real one. And the reason I end on this is I think it's pretty hard to tell with the naked eye which of these is real. In this case, the left-hand person is real, the right-hand person is created by the computer. And then the other thing I want to tell you is these are all examples of the current algorithmic Achilles heel of generating a photo of someone who never existed. These are all made with a generation of photo generator about 3 years old. You now have the ability to generate much more flexible faces. Some of these things are not visible to the naked eye anymore. And in fact, there was a recent study that showed that in a test where you placed an AI-generated photo next to a very similar real photo, that humans do not have the ability to make a good discernment. and curiously tend to think that the AI-generated face is more trustworthy than the real human face. But again, looking at these things by eye is not a good thing to do, and not a good thing for the journalists to do themselves or to try and train others to spot. And I'll give you an example of why that's true. Let's move to deepfake videos. There was a sort of rule of thumb that was suggested a few years back saying you could spot deepfake videos. It was easy because they didn't blink. The problem was that was just a facet of the underlying data, the way a model had been trained. No sooner had a researcher released that claim that you could spot deepfakes because they didn't blink, a few weeks later, the same researcher was sent a video that blinked, right? That's because all of these things are simply the current algorithmic heel of the generation process. So the first thing I want to say on this sort of solution area is, as journalists, and as journalists talking to the public about deepfakes, do not train them to spot deepfakes with the eye. It's not a good idea. It will get outdated quickly. Instead, what you need is to encourage media literacy. So, the media literacy framework we use in Witness is the SIFT framework: stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, trace the claims. Now, your naked eye might give you some clues within that, but it's not the place to start when you look at, for example, a deepfake or another type of video. I want to move next to talking about detection. So are there tools for detection available to journalists, and who has access? And the thing to know is that there is a huge amount of research going into creating synthetic media, right? At a recent conference, the ICCV, the second largest number of papers in this computer vision conference were around image and video synthesis. So there are lots of people trying to think how to create photorealistic videos and video manipulations. And so the detection work, although growing, is far out of proportion to the research going into synthesis. That said, there are many people working on detection. That includes big companies like Facebook, who ran something called the Deepfake Detection Challenge, and includes a range of ways in which people think about deepfake detection. And there are a lot of different academic and research tools that are starting to be built out. I'm going to talk about how and when they're accessible to journalists in a moment, but they, are based on different ideas about detection, right? So sometimes you're trying to do detection based on, is this digitally impossible, right? An image doesn't exist in this way. Pixels can't be created in this way. You can look at a deepfake in the same way you might think about looking for more traditional forms of media manipulation. Can light reflect in a particular way? And you can also look for kind of inconsistency in an image, right? It just couldn't have happened, right? This scene could not have physically taken place, even if it looks photorealistic. And then people are also thinking about how they take the techniques I was describing earlier, that cat and mouse game, to apply deep learning, this process of really trying to use machine learning networks, these neural networks, to detect deepfakes. So how do you actually use the techniques that are used to build deepfakes to detect deepfakes? You also see people building tools that are about specific failures in the generation process. One of my favorites, though it's not really a leading contender to be a successful technology, is an approach that looks to see if there's actually a pulse underlying the deepfake, right? So a deepfake generally doesn't have a pulse, but if you use certain kinds of analysis, you can see under the skin of a real person, you see the pulse, right? So you're looking for the things that are not on the surface of the deepfake synthesis, but are under the surface. And then, and this comes back to who we should worry about. If you are a high-level politician, there's a lot of work, and this is research by Shruti Agarwal and Hani Farid from a couple of years ago, but there are other people working in this area, which basically builds customized models to protect particular individuals who are at high risk. And it really looks for the individual way they speak or move, and then creates ways to see if a potential deepfake matches those. So I've been talking about academic research here. The issue is that on the one hand, these tools are only just starting to be available. And generally they're not available to journalists. And often they have the hardest time dealing with the type of content that you and I encounter in the real world. So high quantity, low quality content, for example, compressed videos, occurring in real time, going across social media platforms, sometimes where perfection is not necessary to create doubt, and where we have to be able to explain it, right? So it's not okay just to say it's a deepfake. We have to explain why we think it's a deepfake. And most of the tools are not yet well structured for that type of approach. So a recommended approach for journalists to think about at this point would be these three things. So I would say, first thing you should do is to look for some of these synthetic media derived telltale glitches or distortions. I do think it's worth taking a look as a journalist to see if these are there. It's just not the primary mode you're going to spot them. Here are some examples of things you might see in both photos and video, right? Those distortions at the hairline, very smooth skin, a difference between the quality of the face and the quality of the body, glitches when someone's face turns sideways. And of course, one way you might explore this is to use a tool, say something like InVid or something like that, to extract a series of frames to review them. Second thing you're going to want to do is actually apply existing video verification and forensics approaches. Use reverse image search to see if this has existing source material. Use a plugin like InVid to look for, to do that reverse image search. All of those things that you may think about that come out of OSINT practice. And then frankly, as these new AI tools start to emerge, you can start adding them in at the end of the process. So for example, there is a tool, and I've not tested this extensively enough on the newest generation of GAN-generated photos, but there is a Chrome plugin that looks for the older generation of fake photos. So you can just use a Chrome plugin to look for those photos. I want to highlight the other side of thinking about detection of deepfakes, which is who has access to the tools. And there is a significant problem around access, right? So we already see that these tools are primarily in the academic zone. We need to start thinking about how they become more accessible to a broader range of individuals who are thinking about their need to detect as a journalist or as a civil society member. And I want to share two examples that tell us, kind of give us a foretaste about how that's going to be happening in the next few years. So I'm going to give you the best case example of journalists spotting a deepfake and the worst case, so you really understand that range. So I'm going to show a best case is actually probably what happened recently if you saw the deepfake of Vladimir Zelensky, which came out about a month ago in Ukraine. This was a video that purported to show the Ukrainian president surrendering. And the reason I describe it as a best case is this was a video that the Ukrainian government had pre-bunked. They'd told people to look out for a video like this. It was not a very high quality deepfake. So in fact, it actually, to the human eye, if you looked at it, you could see, for example, the body didn't match with the head. There was some glitching on the forehead. And in fact, very quickly, Zelensky himself was able to debunk it, to say it's not me, and platforms like Facebook could take it down very quickly. So honestly, the role of journalists here was not too complicated, right? Journalists could look at this, they could look at the pre-bunking, they could look at the work afterwards. Let me show you a different example that shows how this can go very differently though. So this is an example from Myanmar in 2021. A video was released of a well-known politician, U Pyominten, who's been quite prominent over the last year. He's a prominent witness in one of the corruption trials of Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto leader, civilian leader of Myanmar. And this was a video that came out shortly after the coup in Myanmar in 2021, was released online, that apparently showed this man implicating Aung San Suu Kyi in corruption. And the reason I want to share it as an example is because what happened very rapidly, and I'll just play a few seconds of it so you can see the video itself. You know, it's not a good quality video. His voice sounds odd. He's clearly under pressure. His lips don't really sync up with the video. And what happened was that a range of people online said, this must be a deepfake. And the only tools that were accessible, I want to put a warning out for folks to be very careful about using online tools at the moment, because they are not reliable to give you good results. So what happened is people put that video into an online deepfake detector, and it came back generally saying this is a deepfake, right? And so journalists in Myanmar, other journalists in the region, didn't have access to good tools to do a deepfake assessment. And this is a very hard video to do it on because it's compressed, because you don't have access to the person in it, because you don't know if it was deepfaked or wasn't, right? So you have this liar's dividend problem. And the information quickly spread that the Myanmar government was deepfaking people. And the reality was that this was almost certainly a forced confession, not a deepfake. So a forced confession made with force, not with digital means. And the reason I show this is to point to, particularly for those of you in the journalism field, is that we really need to start thinking about how we start to resource journalists to have access to the tools globally, how we think about providing access to media forensics that enables people to escalate cases like this one that are very high profile, and how we support open access tools. Now, I'm conscious of time and I want to make sure we can address some questions, and I see Paul right there. So what I'm going to say is I'm actually going to talk next week about an area that's actually really about kind of how journalists in a pro-social way can protect their footage and really defend it. So I'm going to just give you a teaser as to say that next week I will integrate some discussion around tools for tracking and actually proactively protecting your footage to defend against deepfakes, what are known as authenticity infrastructure and provenance infrastructure. You might have heard of the Content Authenticity Initiative or the C2PA. So next week I'll include discussion around that as we look at how journalists proactively use ways to protect themselves against deepfake and do other things in that area. So as we finish, just want you to remember your mental exercise. Where did you place yourself? Are you still there? Have you shifted? Are you worried? And then just leave you with some key takeaways. So our eyes and ears will fail and deceive us. I don't want to train you to look for the glitches. Detection is not yet adequate, and access to the tools is limited and unequal, and that detection tools must complement other things that we must invest in as a journalistic community, like media literacy and journalistic fact-checking. So I'm going to go to questions now. If you have further things you want to reach out to me, here's my email. And Paul, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sam. That was really, really intensive and quite lovely at the same time. I think also fascinating, especially for our audience that seems to be quite interested in this subject. So there's a question that I think is important for you to take. It's from Malik. Malik is talking about the impact of the quality of the video in being able to identify the red flags that you mentioned. So can a low quality video, can we still use it for this purpose?
Yeah, thank you, Malik, for that question. Low quality videos are the hardest, and they're the hardest for much media forensics work, right? Because a lot of the things that we look for, a lot of the tools that are designed work best on high quality video or original video. And the reality is almost never do we actually encounter high quality original video, right? Even if you put it through, Facebook or Twitter or any social media network. So low quality video is hard because the detection tools don't work well. Low quality video is hard because it often actually creates the artifacts that people perceive as being signs of deepfakes. So for example, the Myanmar video, the glitches are probably due to compression of the video, not because of a deepfake, right? But if you look at it and you don't know, an untrained eye might think that's a sign of fakery. So the tools don't work well on low quality video. Low quality video gives you false signs. And of course, in many cases, people do what's known as counter forensics, which is that you may low resolution a video to make it harder to use the tools. So absolutely, the reality is we have a hard time, and low quality video is one of the hardest areas.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. There's also this question I think is aligned with the latest question that is coming up, which is, I remember something that happened in Nigeria. A video surfaced online, a newspaper published a video online purportedly showing a state governor receiving bribes, I think in dollars. But the governor turned around to call the video fake news, that it was doctored. So if we now look at it from the other angles, what tools are available for journalists to show that their videos are not actually deepfakes, they're not fake videos?
Yeah, this has come up a lot, and I just finished a Witness strategic visioning where we talked a lot about how do you fortify your truth when you're a journalist or someone else who's trying to think about defending your material. I think there are a number of ways to think about it. One is, using some of the tools I'm going to talk about next week that allow you to show an original, show where it was created, show it's not been tampered with. So, right, like creating material that can be more easily authenticated and proven what is the original, showing the changes, right? So if you can show that a video looked like a particular way in a particular moment, you can show if it's been edited and prove the changes. You know, in the citizen journalism context, we often actually talk about the very basics of actually, you know, doing the things that filming, you know, landmarks, filming 360, all the things that are actually quite hard to deepfake, right? So someone claims that you deepfaked a 360 video, that's pretty hard, right? It's actually really hard to do that in a real life situation. I think what you're pointing to, Paul, though, is also exactly an example of this liar's dividend, that people in power can very easily say that sex video, that corruption video, it could be fake or it is fake, and then it puts the pressure on journalists to prove it's real. And that's pretty hard to do that conclusively. And we're definitely seeing that probably more frequently than actual deepfake videos.
Yeah, there is this question from Janika. The Caribbean region, in my home words, is a sitting duck when it comes to vulnerability to such manipulation. Untrained practitioners, understaffed and under-resourced newsrooms, entrenched media distrust, and social media platforms that are arguably more popular than legacy media. How can conscientious journalists help protect their viewership and leadership when the population in general struggles with identifying even shallow fakes, that is, static images and test documents that have been falsified?
Thank you, Janika. It's a great question. And it takes me back to the reality that most of the falsifications, the deception of the moment are shallow fakes, right? Including very simple photo and text shallow fakes. I think there's two things that it's responsible for a journalist to do now, or practical. The first is to really play a role in helping support people to have the sort of basic media literacies and some of the tools that are available to detect shallow fakes, right? Those, for example, the SIFT framework I mentioned, or the tools you can use like reverse image search to look for an original video or photo. I think that's one part. The second is actually fighting the deepfake rhetoric. I think in general, in many populations, people assume there are more sophisticated media manipulations out there than reality. And so it's actually really important that we not prematurely create a sense that you can't believe anything because it could have been highly sophisticatedly faked, when in fact the existing problem are shallow fakes, and we should support people on that. And also that rhetoric on the deep fakes undermines confidence in existing images and video. So I would go in those two places, knowing that it's an uphill battle. And I recognize that, there's an existing problem that is already challenging with shallow fakes and journalists' ability to challenge them in the public sphere.
Yeah, thank you. I think probably second to last question, Jeff would like to know, does Witness work with any video provenance tools or technology providers? You mentioned C2PA, but looks like still images, not video. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
So Witness works on sort of two sides of this. We work on open source tools. So we work on a tool called Proof Mode that is a kind of open source tool for people to easily add rich metadata to videos, hash it, cryptographically sign it, and share it. That's incorporated in a number of other tools. And we work with some of the coalitions that are building these standards, which I'll talk about more next week, like the Content Authenticity Initiative that Adobe launched, and the C2PA that includes players like BBC and Microsoft. And they are currently moving from standards to implementation. And what that means is there's an underlying structure that's been built around how to create ways to understand where a piece of media came from, how it was edited, and people are starting to build tools actually for photos and video in that space. And then the other space that is interesting is the space of people trying to think about how Web3 interacts with this. So for example, distributed ledger technologies, and we collaborate with a group called Starling Project who are thinking about how you think about the role of distributed ledger technologies in verification and storage of videos to protect their integrity.
Yeah, can you stop sharing the screen?
Yes, of course.
Yes, so as we wrap up, I'll just, I think we've had enough questions for the day. So there is this question that I also wanted to answer as we wrap up. Do you still think, there is this two different schools of thought regarding how journalism should handle deepfakes, which is one school of thought says deepfakes are not really a threat to journalism, while another says is a major threat. The last piece I read was about 2 years old regarding this subject, looking at the state of deepfakes and synthetic media in journalism. How do you think this should be regarded in the present day journalism? Is it, should we consider it as a major threat?
I think that both those perspectives are wrong. I think it's incorrect to think that deepfakes are inconsequential because of the technological developments. There is massive amount of resources being placed into this. The techniques are getting more robust. The direction of travel technologically is definitely to make it easier to do this, more frequent, more available. So dismissing it, given also what we know about how people use deceptive media and the way this starts to position itself, and knowing that it's already being used in these non-consensual sexual images, it's not a minor worry. At the same time, the kind of hype that says this is the biggest concern that journalists should have, that this undermines every truth, as I say, I think has been premature because it also contributed to the damage. So again, for us, it's like, it's worth preparing now while still moderating the panic, right? So it will not be helpful to journalists in 5 years' time to then panic and say, why don't we have the detection tools that work for journalists? Why haven't we built infrastructure that supports journalists globally? Why have we not prepared the public? So we really need to do that work while treading a fine line not to create a panic that implies that deepfakes are everywhere and that they're the primary way in which people are deceived right now.
I think we've tried. So, so guys, next week we'll still be here to take more questions and to get more insights regarding this subject matter. Before we go, so Sam, what do you think the major take home from today's session should be for journalists? And in a summarized version, can you conclude?
Sure, summarized version should be, you should be thinking about deepfakes, working with your readers, viewers, consumers to de-escalate their panic, but not to give them a false hope that there's not a problem here that's emerging. You should be in your journalistic communities advocating for access to these tools and making sure they work for journalists in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Myanmar, in Pakistan, as well as in North America and Europe, where too many eyes are focused on those audiences. And then as you actually look at the tools, you should be aware your eyes are going to deceive you. The detection tools are not reliable at the moment and should be treated with caution, and that there are some promising solutions starting to emerge around authenticity that could help support your work.
So thank you very much, Sam. And like I said, we'll be back next week to look at how we can positively deploy these tools as journalists. So whatever questions that we couldn't get, that we couldn't take, that you still have, please do not hesitate to keep them coming, and we'll get to them next week. Join us same time next week for this session. And I want to appreciate Sam for taking the time. It was really hard getting Sam to take this session. I'm really glad we are doing this. And so if you would like to know more about the ICFJ's World Global Crisis Reporting Forum, I encourage you to please check us out on Facebook. We have a very active Facebook forum, and just go to the chat box now. Stella has put the direct link, click the link, and join us there. And we'll be able to share the slides with you for your personal consumption. And for those that are asking about the video, because I think some participants are interested in taking this session as a step-down training for their colleagues, and we will be sharing the video. It will be live on the ICFJ's YouTube page, and probably by the end of the day of tomorrow. And so we always post it there. And if you're a forum member, if you join us on that Facebook group, I'll share the video, link to the video, and you can use it for your training. And if you are doing that and would like to support in as much as we can, please do not hesitate to reach out with us to me if you are doing this on the to train your colleagues on this subject. I will be looking forward to how we can help you to be more effective and achieve your set goals. To learn more about the ICFJ's project, please check out the International Center for Journalists on www.icfj.org. And we have lots of resources for journalists via the IGNet platform. Do not hesitate to check out the IGNet website on www.ignet.org. I can see our participants are quite active and still engaging. I wish we can keep this going, but really, I would like to wrap up here and I say, have a lovely day. Sam, thank you very much. And everybody, thanks for joining us today. We'll see you same time next week.